The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace in Lomé, as FAUREGnassingbé reviewed the daily security reports in his private office. The leather chair creaked under his weight as he leaned back, studying the papers with growing concern. Street protests had been erupting across the capital for 3 weeks now, each demonstration growing larger and more vocal than the last. What started as small gatherings of university students had transformed into massive crowds demanding political change. Outside his bulletproof windows, the distant sound of chanting could be heard even through the thick walls of the fortified building. The president's security chief, Colonel Mensah, knocked and entered without waiting for permission. His face was grim, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The situation reports he carried painted a troubling picture of unrest spreading beyond the capital, into rural areas that had remained quiet for decades. Across the city, market vendor Akosua finished arranging her tomatoes and onions as she had, every morning for 15 years. But today felt different. The usual morning rush of customers was replaced by groups of people walking purposefully toward the city center, many carrying homemade signs and banners. Her neighbor's teenage son ran past, shouting excitedly about a massive gathering planned for the main square. The electricity in the air was palpable. In the university district, Professor Kofi gathered his students in a cramped classroom, their faces illuminated by the glow of smartphones showing social media feeds filled with protest videos. Word was spreading that today would be the day everything changed. Messages were being shared in local languages and French, calling for people from all walks of life to join together. The professor had seen many political movements in his 40 years, but never anything with this level of grassroots energy and organization. Meanwhile, in military barracks across the country, soldiers were having quiet conversations in mess halls and dormitories. Many came from the same neighborhoods now filled with protesters. Some had family members in the crowds demanding change. The traditional loyalty to the chain of command was being tested, as reports came in of massive demonstrations in multiple cities simultaneously. Radio chatter between units carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that senior officers were struggling to manage. The president's wife, Nana, watched the news coverage from their private residence, her hands trembling as she held her morning coffee. International news crews were arriving in the country, setting up cameras and interviewing citizens who spoke boldly about their hopes for political transformation. Social media platforms were flooded with videos shot on cell phones, showing the scale of public sentiment. She had lived through political upheavals in other West African nations and recognized the signs of a movement that could not be easily contained. As afternoon approached, the convergence of thousands of people toward the capital center created traffic jams unlike anything the city had seen. Buses were abandoned as drivers joined the marching crowds. Shop owners closed their businesses early, some to join the demonstrations, others out of concern for what might unfold. The police cordons that had been effective at containing smaller protests were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of participants arriving from every direction. Inside the palace, emergency meetings were being called as reports flooded in of similar scenes playing out across the nation. Communication networks were struggling under the volume of messages being shared between organizers and participants. The president's advisors presented him with increasingly stark assessments of the situation's gravity. Traditional methods of crowd control appeared inadequate for the scale of civil unrest now unfolding. Young activist Amma stood on an improvised platform in the main square, her voice carrying over loudspeakers to a sea of faces stretching beyond what she could see. The crowd responded to her words with waves of cheering and chanting that echoed off the surrounding buildings. She spoke of dignity, opportunity, and the right of citizens to choose their own future. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other protest leaders across the country reporting similar scenes in their cities. As evening descended, the palace was surrounded by a human tide unlike anything in the nation's history. The massive crowd had swelled to numbers that made accurate counting impossible, with people continuing to arrive even as darkness fell. Makeshift lighting was set up, and the demonstration took on a festival atmosphere despite its serious political purpose. Musicians began playing, food vendors appeared, and families with children joined what had become a celebration of collective will and determination for change. The second day brought even larger crowds as word spread internationally about the unprecedented demonstrations sweeping across Togo. Foreign journalists descended on the capital, their satellite trucks creating a media village near the main protest sites. International news networks began broadcasting live coverage, showing the world images of peaceful but determined citizens demanding political change. The global attention added pressure and legitimacy to the movement that organizers had not anticipated. Inside the presidential palace, FAURE Gnassinggbé found himself increasingly isolated as key advisors began suggesting he consider negotiating with protest leaders. The Interior Minister arrived with reports that regional governors were struggling to maintain control in their jurisdictions. Some local officials had even publicly expressed sympathy with the demonstrators' grievances. The president paced his office, making increasingly frantic phone calls to regional allies who seemed reluctant to offer the strong support he expected. Colonel Mensah delivered the most troubling report yet to the president's inner circle. Several military units were showing signs of divided loyalty, with some officers openly questioning orders to disperse civilian protesters. At the main barracks outside Lomé, soldiers were seen talking with family members who had joined the demonstrations. The chain of command that had maintained stability for years was beginning to show cracks under the pressure of a popular movement that included many military families. Dr. Adjoa, a prominent physician and civil society leader, emerged as one of the key voices representing the protest movement. Her medical clinic had treated injured protesters over the past months, and her reputation for integrity made her a natural spokesperson. She organized press conferences where she articulated the demonstrators' demands with clarity and dignity that impressed international observers. Her background as a healthcare professional who had served communities across the country gave her credibility that transcended partisan politics. The economic impact of the sustained protests began affecting daily life as businesses remained closed and transportation networks were disrupted. However, rather than turning public opinion against the demonstrators, the economic disruption seemed to strengthen resolve. Market vendors, taxi drivers, and small business owners who would normally be concerned about lost income instead joined the protests, calculating that short-term sacrifice was worth long-term political change. International pressure intensified as regional bodies and foreign governments issued statements calling for peaceful dialogue and respect for citizens' rights to peaceful assembly. The African Union dispatched a delegation to assess the situation, while former heads of state from neighboring countries offered to mediate discussions between the government and protest leaders. The president found himself fielding calls from international partners who expressed concern about stability in the region. Social media played a crucial role in maintaining momentum and coordination across multiple protest sites. Young activists used messaging apps to share real-time updates about crowd sizes, police movements, and organizational logistics. Videos of peaceful demonstrators singing traditional songs and sharing food went viral internationally, creating a positive image of the movement that countered government attempts to portray the protests as violent or disruptive. Religious leaders from various faiths joined together in supporting calls for peaceful political transition. The influential Council of Religious Leaders issued a joint statement endorsing the protesters' demands, while calling for nonviolence from all parties. Churches and mosques across the country opened their doors to provide rest areas and meeting spaces for demonstrators, further legitimizing the movement within traditional community structures. The president's wife, Nana, began making discreet inquiries about international safe havens through diplomatic contacts. She had witnessed similar political upheavals in other African nations and understood that once popular movements reached critical mass, outcomes could change rapidly. Her conversations with embassy officials suggested that international support for her husband's position was weakening as images of massive peaceful protests dominated global news coverage. As the third day dawned, helicopter footage revealed the full scale of the demonstrations for the first time. The aerial views showed human rivers flowing through every major street leading to government buildings, with protest camps established in parks and public squares throughout the capital. The images were broadcast internationally, providing undeniable evidence of the popular support behind demands for political change. Inside the palace, emergency cabinet meetings grew increasingly tense as ministers debated response options. Some advocated for negotiations and gradual reforms, while others pushed for stronger security measures. The president found himself presiding over a divided government as the protests continued to grow in size and international legitimacy. Phone lines to the palace were jammed with calls from concerned officials, international partners, and family members seeking guidance about the rapidly evolving situation. Young protest leader Kwame coordinated with organizers in regional cities through encrypted messaging apps, sharing strategies that had proven effective in maintaining peaceful discipline among massive crowds. The decentralized leadership structure that had emerged made the movement resilient and difficult for authorities to disrupt through traditional tactics of targeting individual leaders. Each local organizing committee adapted the overall strategy to their specific circumstances while maintaining unity of purpose. The turning point came when General Kwaku, the respected head of the armed forces, requested a private meeting with President Gnassingbé. The veteran military leader had served loyally for over 2 decades, but the conversation in the president's private study was unlike any they had shared before. The general spoke quietly but firmly about the impossible position facing soldiers who were being asked to confront their own family members and neighbors in peaceful demonstrations. Intelligence reports reaching the presidential palace painted an increasingly dire picture of the government's position. Regional commanders were reporting that local police units were refusing orders to use force against protesters. In some areas, security personnel had actually joined the demonstrations, removing their uniforms and walking alongside civilians demanding political change. The apparatus of state control that had maintained order for years was crumbling from within. International pressure reached a new level when the United Nations Secretary-General issued a statement calling for immediate dialogue between all parties and respect for the democratic rights of Togolese citizens. The European Union announced that they were reviewing all diplomatic and economic relationships pending the outcome of the political crisis. These international positions made it clear that the president's traditional sources of external support were evaporating as quickly as his domestic authority. Dr. Adjoa met with international mediators who had arrived in the capital to facilitate discussions between the government and protest representatives. The opposition leaders' calm professionalism and clear articulation of democratic demands impressed the foreign diplomats, who began reporting back to their governments that the protest movement had legitimate leadership capable of responsible governance. These assessments further undermined international confidence in the current administration. Inside military barracks across the country, unprecedented scenes were unfolding as soldiers gathered in groups to discuss their loyalties and obligations. Many came from families that were actively participating in the protests, creating personal conflicts between professional duty and family relationships. Senior non-commissioned officers, who formed the backbone of military discipline, began expressing doubts about orders that would require them to act against peaceful civilians. The president's inner circle grew smaller each day as advisors and cabinet ministers found excuses to distance themselves from decision-making processes. Several key officials quietly left the country on official business trips that seemed unlikely to result in their return. The isolation of the presidential palace became both physical and political, as the massive crowds outside made normal government operations impossible. Market trader Akasua found herself speaking to international journalists about her decision to close her stall and join the protests despite the economic hardship. Her simple but powerful explanation of why political change was worth personal sacrifice resonated with media audiences around the world. Her interview was shared widely on social media, humanizing the movement and demonstrating its broad popular base across all social classes. Religious services across the country became focal points for organizing and spiritual support for the protest movement. Sermons emphasized themes of justice, peaceful resistance, and moral courage. Churches and mosques provided not just meeting spaces but also food distribution points and medical aid stations for demonstrators. The involvement of religious institutions gave the movement additional moral authority and helped maintain its peaceful character. Colonel Mensah faced an increasingly impossible situation as his security apparatus began fragmenting. Radio communications revealed that many field commanders were simply not responding to orders, while others were reporting that their units were unwilling to deploy against civilian protesters. The security chief's own bodyguard unit began showing signs of divided loyalty, with some personnel requesting transfers or leave, rather than participate in potential confrontations with demonstrators. International media coverage now dominated global news cycles, with major networks maintaining continuous coverage of the evolving situation. Satellite imagery and drone footage provided undeniable documentation of the scale of popular participation in the protests. These images made it impossible for the government to control the narrative about what was happening in the country, as international audiences could see the reality with their own eyes. The economic impact of the sustained demonstrations began, affecting government operations as civil servants joined the protests in large numbers. Tax collection ceased, port operations slowed, and routine government services ground to a halt. Rather than pressuring protesters to return to work, these disruptions seemed to strengthen their resolve and demonstrate the depth of popular opposition to the current administration. Professor Kofi organized a delegation of university faculty who issued a joint statement supporting the students and citizens participating in the demonstrations. The academic community's formal endorsement of the movement provided intellectual credibility and helped counter government attempts to portray the protests as driven by foreign influence or radical elements. The professor's statement emphasized constitutional principles and democratic governance. As night fell on what would become the decisive day, protest organizers announced through social media and local radio that the next morning would bring the largest demonstration yet. The call was for every citizen who supported democratic change to converge on the Capitol for what they termed a final push for political transformation. The announcement sent shockwaves through the presidential palace, as intelligence reports suggested that the response would indeed be unprecedented in scale. The dawn of the climactic day brought scenes that would be remembered in Togolese history for generations. Buses, trucks, and vehicles of every description converged on the capital from across the country, carrying citizens who had traveled through the night to participate in what organizers promised would be the decisive demonstration. The highways leading to Lomé became rivers of humanity as people walked alongside vehicles when traffic ground to a complete halt. President Gnassingbé stood at his office window watching the approaching crowds with a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 1 million people were converging on the capital, representing nearly 15% of the entire national population. The sheer scale of the demonstration made any security response impossible, as it would require confronting what amounted to a significant portion of the citizenry. General Kwaku arrived at the palace with news that would change everything. 3 major military units had formally declared their support for the protest movement and were refusing all orders from the presidential command structure. The general's own loyalty was clearly wavering, as he reported that maintaining military discipline had become impossible when soldiers were being asked to act against their families, friends, and neighbors participating in peaceful demonstrations. International journalists captured unprecedented footage of military personnel removing their insignia and joining the civilian protesters. These images, broadcast live around the world, provided undeniable evidence that the government had lost control of its own security apparatus. Foreign diplomats began making discreet inquiries about evacuation procedures as the political situation appeared to be reaching an irreversible tipping point. Dr. Adjoa addressed the massive crowd from multiple platforms set up throughout the city center, her words carried by loudspeakers and radio broadcasts to ensure everyone could hear the message. She outlined a peaceful transition plan that had been developed by opposition leaders in consultation with international mediators. The plan called for immediate democratic elections overseen by neutral observers and guaranteed safe passage for current government officials who cooperated with the transition. Inside the presidential palace, the remaining staff began showing signs of abandoning their posts. Kitchen workers, security guards, and administrative personnel quietly left their positions throughout the morning. The president found himself with only his closest family members and a handful of loyal bodyguards remaining in a building that had housed dozens of staff just days before. The isolation was complete and undeniable. Colonel Mensah faced the ultimate test of his career when his own security detail informed him that they could no longer guarantee the president's safety. The bodyguards explained that they had families in the crowds outside and could not in good conscience take action against peaceful civilians. Their resignation from duty was respectful but firm, leaving the security chief with no operational capacity to protect the government. The crowd outside the palace gates grew so dense that movement became difficult, but the atmosphere remained celebratory rather than hostile. Musicians played traditional songs while food vendors distributed free meals to demonstrators. Children played games while their parents participated in what had become a massive civic celebration. The peaceful nature of the crowd made any violent response impossible to justify to international observers. Foreign embassy personnel began implementing evacuation procedures for their citizens as the political situation reached what diplomats recognized as a point of no return. However, the peaceful nature of the demonstrations meant that evacuations were precautionary rather than emergency measures. International observers noted that despite the massive scale of the protests, there had been remarkably little violence or property damage throughout the movement. Social media networks struggled to handle the volume of posts, photos, and videos being shared from the demonstration sites. Hashtags related to the Togolese protests began trending globally as international users shared content and expressed support for the peaceful movement. The digital dimension of the protest amplified its impact far beyond the country's borders and made government control of information impossible. University students who had initiated the original protests weeks earlier found themselves at the center of a historic moment. Young activist Amma stood before international cameras explaining how their small study group discussions about democracy and human rights had grown into a nationwide movement for political change. Her articulate presentation of the students' original goals impressed foreign journalists and demonstrated the intellectual foundation of the popular uprising. Religious leaders from across the country gathered at the main protest site to offer prayers for peaceful resolution and democratic transition. The interfaith ceremony was broadcast live on international television, showing the world that the movement had broad support across all sectors of society. The presence of respected religious figures provided additional moral authority and helped maintain the disciplined, nonviolent character of the demonstrations. As the day progressed, reports came in of similar massive demonstrations in every major city across the country. Regional governors began issuing statements distancing themselves from the central government and expressing support for democratic transition. The coordinated nature of the nationwide protests demonstrated a level of organization and popular support that made continued resistance futile. The president's wife, Nana, made the final preparations for what appeared to be an inevitable departure from the country. Her conversations with international contacts had confirmed that safe passage could be arranged, but only if the transition proceeded peacefully, without attempts to use military force against the demonstrators. The window for negotiated departure was closing as rapidly as the crowd outside was growing. The decisive moment arrived when General Kwaku returned to the palace with an ultimatum that would end the political standoff. Accompanied by senior military commanders who had spent the morning in emergency consultations, the general informed President Gnassinggbé that the armed forces could no longer support his administration. The military leadership had voted unanimously to side with the peaceful protesters and facilitate an immediate transition to civilian democratic governance. The president's last remaining cabinet ministers gathered in the emergency meeting room, where the gravity of the situation became undeniable. Intelligence reports confirmed that government authority had collapsed across the entire country, with local officials either joining the protests or simply abandoning their posts. The finance minister reported that the central bank staff had walked out, making it impossible to access government funds or maintain basic financial operations. Outside the palace walls, the crowd had grown so massive that it stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Drone footage captured by international news networks showed an ocean of people that defied accurate counting. The demonstration had evolved into a peaceful occupation of the entire government district, with protesters establishing supply lines, medical stations, and communication networks that demonstrated remarkable organizational sophistication. Colonel Mensah made his final report to the president with obvious reluctance and personal anguish. The security apparatus had completely collapsed, with police units across the country either joining the protesters or simply going home to their families. The remaining presidential guard consisted of fewer than a dozen loyal soldiers who were vastly outnumbered and completely surrounded by peaceful but determined civilians demanding political change. Dr. Adjoa received word through international mediators that several foreign governments were prepared to facilitate the president's safe departure from the country in exchange for his immediate resignation and cooperation with democratic transition. The offer included guarantees of personal safety and freedom from prosecution in return for a peaceful handover of power. The opposition leaders' willingness to negotiate safe passage demonstrated the movement's commitment to nonviolence even in victory. The president's family members gathered in the private residential quarters of the palace as the reality of their situation became unavoidable. Nana had already packed essential belongings and made arrangements for their children's safety. The sound of the massive crowd outside had become a constant background noise that made normal conversation impossible. The walls that had protected them for years now felt like a prison surrounded by the entire population of the country. International pressure reached its peak when the United Nations Security Council announced an emergency session to discuss the situation in Togo. Major world powers issued coordinated statements calling for immediate democratic transition and respect for the will of the people, as demonstrated through peaceful protest. The international isolation of the government became complete, as even traditional allies distanced themselves from what was clearly an unsustainable position. Inside the crowd, market vendor Akosua found herself standing next to university professors, religious leaders, and people from every walk of life who had united in demanding political change. The diversity of the demonstration was remarkable, with elderly citizens who remembered the country's independence standing alongside young students who represented its future. The generational unity was a powerful symbol of the broad consensus supporting democratic transformation. Military units that had declared support for the protesters began providing security and logistical support for the massive demonstration. Soldiers helped organize crowd flow, provided medical assistance, and ensured that the peaceful nature of the protest was maintained. The sight of military personnel working alongside civilian protesters sent a clear message that the security forces had definitively switched sides in the political confrontation. Communication networks throughout the capital were overwhelmed by the volume of calls and messages as family members tried to coordinate and stay in contact during the historic events. Social media platforms crashed and recovered repeatedly under the load of posts from participants sharing their experiences. The digital documentation of the day's events created an unprecedented record of popular democratic mobilization. Professor Kofi addressed international journalists about the significance of what was happening, explaining how the movement represented not just a change of government but a fundamental transformation in the country's political culture. The academic's analysis helped international audiences understand that they were witnessing something more profound than a simple power struggle, but rather a genuine democratic awakening that had mobilized an entire society. As afternoon approached, the atmosphere in the crowd remained festive, despite the serious political purpose of the gathering. Street vendors appeared with food and water, musicians continued performing, and families with children participated in what had become a national celebration of democratic values. The peaceful, joyful character of the demonstration made it impossible for anyone to portray the protesters as violent or extremist. The final negotiations began when international mediators entered the palace under the protection of military units that had switched sides. The mediators carried a formal proposal for the president's resignation and departure that had been endorsed by major international powers. The terms were generous, offering personal safety and financial security in exchange for immediate cooperation with democratic transition. The alternative, everyone understood, was an increasingly untenable situation that could only end one way. Religious leaders in the crowd began organizing prayer circles as word spread that the endgame was approaching. The spiritual dimension of the movement had been important throughout, with many participants viewing their involvement as a moral obligation. As the sun began to set on what everyone sensed would be the final day of the old political order, the prayers for peaceful resolution intensified across the massive gathering of citizens who had changed their nation through collective action. The climactic moment arrived as the sun reached its zenith over the capital city. President FAURE Gnassinggbé sat alone in his office, staring at the resignation letter that international mediators had prepared for his signature. Through the bulletproof windows, he could see the endless sea of citizens who had surrounded his palace for what seemed like an eternity. The sound of their voices had become a constant presence, rising and falling like ocean waves against the walls of power. General Kwaku entered the presidential office for the final time, accompanied by two soldiers whose faces showed the strain of the impossible situation they all faced. The general's voice was steady but heavy with emotion as he explained that continuing resistance would only lead to unnecessary bloodshed. The military's loyalty had shifted completely to the people outside, and no force remained that could sustain the current government against such overwhelming popular opposition. The president's hands trembled as he signed the document that would end his political career and his family's long hold on power. The signature seemed to take forever, each letter carefully formed while the weight of history pressed down on the room. When he finally set down the pen, the silence was deafening despite the crowd noise from outside. The old order had officially ended with the scratch of ink on paper. Word of the resignation spread through the massive crowd like wildfire, carried by radio broadcasts, social media posts, and simple word of mouth that rippled outward from the palace gates. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, with cheers erupting across the entire government district as hundreds of thousands of people celebrated simultaneously. The sound was unlike anything the capital had ever heard, a roar of joy and relief that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Dr. Adjoa stood before the international media cameras that had been broadcasting the historic events around the world. Her voice carried clearly across the celebrating crowd as she announced that democracy had prevailed through the peaceful determination of the Togolese people. The opposition leader's dignity and composure in victory impressed observers who had watched her emerge as a natural leader throughout the crisis. Her words of reconciliation and healing resonated far beyond her immediate audience. Inside the palace, the former president gathered his family for their departure, under the protection of international mediators and military units that had guaranteed their safety. The scene was surreal as they walked through corridors that had housed the seat of power for decades, now empty except for the echoing sounds of celebration from outside. Nana carried a single suitcase containing the few possessions they would take into exile. The moment that would be remembered forever occurred as the palace doors opened and the former president appeared before the massive crowd that had demanded his resignation. The silence that fell over hundreds of thousands of people was complete and profound, as if the entire nation was holding its breath. For several long seconds, the man who had ruled their country stood facing the citizens who had peacefully removed him from power. Colonel Mensah, his loyalty finally tested beyond its limits, stepped forward with the symbolic act that completed the transition. The security chief removed his insignia of office and placed them on the ground before joining the crowd of citizens who had reclaimed their government. His gesture was captured by dozens of cameras and would become an iconic image of the peaceful revolution that had transformed the nation through collective action rather than violence. The former president was escorted to a waiting vehicle by international observers and military personnel who maintained their professionalism despite the historic nature of the moment. As the convoy departed the palace grounds, the crowd parted respectfully, maintaining the peaceful character that had defined their movement from beginning to end. The discipline and dignity shown even in victory demonstrated the mature democratic instincts of a people ready for self-governance. Young activist Amma climbed onto the platform where opposition leaders were addressing the celebrating crowd. Her voice, which had called for change in university discussion groups just months earlier, now carried across a sea of people who had answered that call. The students spoke about the future they would build together, emphasizing education, opportunity, and justice for all citizens, regardless of their background or political history. Market vendor Akosua found herself embracing strangers who had become brothers and sisters through their shared commitment to democratic change. The woman who had closed her tomato stand to join the protests was now part of a historic moment that would be studied and remembered for generations. Her simple decision to prioritize political freedom over economic security had contributed to a transformation that affected millions of lives. International news networks struggled to capture the full scope of the celebration that erupted across the country as word spread of the successful transition. In every city and town, people took to the streets in spontaneous demonstrations of joy and relief. The peaceful nature of the victory celebration matched the disciplined character of the protest movement that had achieved the impossible through collective action and moral courage. As evening fell on the first day of the new democratic era, religious leaders from all faiths gathered for interfaith prayers of thanksgiving and reconciliation. The ceremony emphasized forgiveness, healing, and unity as the nation prepared to move forward together despite the divisions of the past. The spiritual foundation of the movement had sustained its peaceful character and would continue to guide the transition to democratic governance. The palace gates, which had been closed to the people for so many years, were thrown open as citizens walked freely through the grounds of their government. Families took photographs at locations that had been forbidden to them, while children played on lawns that had been reserved for the powerful elite. The symbolism was profound and immediate, demonstrating that power truly belonged to the people who had peacefully reclaimed it through their collective will and determination.